had the distinct pleasure of living inside two biospheres. Of course, we all here in this room live in Biosphere 1. I also lived in Biosphere 2. And the wonderful thing about that is that I get to compare biospheres. And hopefully from that I get to learn something. So what did I learn? Well, here I am inside Biosphere 2 making a pizza. So I am harvesting the wheat in order to make the dough. And then, of course, I have to milk the goats and feed the goats in order to make the cheese. It took me 4 months in Biosphere 2 to make a pizza. Here in Biosphere 1, well, it takes me about 2 minutes because I pick up the phone and I call and say, hey, can you deliver the pizza? So Biosphere 2 was essentially a 3-acre, entirely sealed miniature world that I lived in for 2 years and 20 minutes. And over the top, it was sealed with steel and glass. Underneath, it was sealed with a pan of steel, essentially entirely sealed.
This cool-looking giant greenhouse building is known as Biosphere 2.
Okay, but where's Biosphere 1?
That's a great question. That's one that we're commonly asked. So, Biosphere 1 is the Earth.
This is John Adams, Deputy Director of Biosphere 2, which is currently owned and operated by the University of Arizona.
Biosphere 2 was really thought up in the early 80s with this notion that there was a lot of discussions about space travel, extended stays in space, and the recognition was, how are you going to do that?
Back in the mid-80s, when we were designing Biosphere 2, we had to ask ourselves some pretty basic questions. I mean, what is a biosphere? Back then, yes, I guess we all know now that it's essentially the sphere of life around the Earth, right? Well, you had to get a little bit more specific than that if you're going to build one. And so, well, we decided that what it really is that it is entirely materially closed, that is, nothing goes in or out at all, no material, and energetically open, which is essentially what planet Earth is. This is a chamber that was 1/400th the size of Biosphere 2 that we called our test module. And the very first day that this fellow, John Allen, walked in to spend a couple of days in there with all the plants and animals and bacteria that we'd put in there to hopefully keep him alive, the doctors were incredibly concerned that he was going to succumb to some dreadful toxin or his lungs were going to get choked with bacteria or something, fungus. Well, of course, none of that happened. And over the ensuing few years, there was great sagas about designing Biosphere 2, but by 1991, we finally had this thing built, and it was time for us to go in and give it a go. We needed to know, is life this malleable? Can you take this biosphere that has evolved on a planetary scale and jam it into a little bottle, and will it survive? Big questions.
Biosphere 2 was designed to contain 5 biomes or habitats: a rainforest, an ocean, a savanna, a mangrove wetland, and a fog desert, along with an agricultural area and living quarters. Although people don't live in the biosphere anymore, the ecosystems are still thriving and have been growing for over 20 years now.
So we're walking through what we call the lowland of the rainforest, and you know, the rainforest is a pretty cool area. I mean, if you can believe it, we're standing in southern Arizona, but look where we're standing.
Yeah, this is amazing.
So all of this growth that you see, you know, has taken place over the past 23 years that this system has been growing and establishing.
It looks like you're running out of room. The trees are hitting the ceiling now.
Oh, they are. And you know, one of the things we periodically have to do is we have to go in and trim those upper canopy trees. Now, I think the most important thing for people to remember is that you can never recreate Earth in its entirety. It's impossible. There's just too many complex things. Really?
Let's get out of here, guys. No.
But what you have now is you have plants that have been growing for about 23 years. You have a soil column that's confined and isolated from the outside world. So underneath all of Biosphere is a big stainless steel liner. So there's no exchange or interaction with the desert soil outside. So all of this is evolving and able to grow inside of this system with very little influence from the outside.
Well, in 1991, it was finally time for us to go in and try out this baby. Let's take it on a maiden voyage. Will it work, or will something happen that we can't understand and we can't fix, thereby negating the concept of man-made biospheres? So 8 of us went in, 4 men and 4 women. Enough on that later. And this is the world that we lived in. So on the top, we had this beautiful rainforest and an ocean. And then underneath, we had all this technosphere, we called it, which is where all the pumps and the valves and the water tanks and the air handlers and all of that. One of the biospherians called it Garden of Eden on top of an aircraft carrier. And then we also had the human habitat, of course, with the laboratories and all of that. The day I walked into Biosphere2, I was for the first time breathing a completely different atmosphere than everybody else in the world, except 7 other people. At that moment, I became part of that biosphere. And I don't mean that in an abstract sense. I mean it rather literally. When I breathed out, my CO2 fed the sweet potatoes that I was growing. And we ate an awful lot of sweet potatoes. And those sweet potatoes became part of me. In fact, we ate so many sweet potatoes, I became orange with sweet potato. I literally was eating the same carbon over and over again. I was eating myself in some strange sort of bizarre way. When it came to our atmosphere, however, it wasn't that much of a joke over the long term, because it turned out that we were losing oxygen, quite a lot of oxygen. And we knew that we were losing CO2, and so we were working like crazy to sequester carbon. Good Lord, we know that term now. We were growing plants like crazy. We were taking their biomass, storing them in the basement, growing plants, doing around and around and around, trying to take all of that carbon out of the atmosphere. We were trying to stop carbon from going into the atmosphere. We stopped irrigating our soil as much as we could. We stopped tilling so that we could prevent greenhouse gases from going into the air. But our oxygen was going down faster than our CO2 was going up, which was quite unexpected, because we had seen them going in tandem in the test module. And it was like playing atomic hide-and-seek. We had lost 7 tons of oxygen, and we had no clue where it was.
No, in order to achieve these environmental conditions, there is a suite of mechanical equipment that sits below us in a basement-like space that we call the Technosphere. Biosphere itself, the footprint is a little over 3 acres, and you have almost 2 acres in this Technosphere space where we have these big units here. These are our workhorses. These are air handlers, so they circulate the air as well as condition it. Up above, we can see all kinds of pipes that are running, so these are going to move water from one location to another, electrical lines, pumps, motors, but it takes all of this to recreate that which Earth is doing every day for us.
In addition to controlling airflow, there's another major issue that the Biosphere designers had to consider. Biosphere 2 has a volume of 7.2 million cubic feet. As a closed system, it's designed to lose very little of the air it contains. But Biosphere 2 sits in the middle of the Arizona desert and is subject to large temperature changes from day to night.
You heat the air up, it expands. It's got to go somewhere, and it's the only way it can go is to push out on the glass and eventually create enough pressure to cause an explosion.
Kablooey.
Or at night, as it cools enough, you could have greater external pressure than internal, and you create an implosion.
Backwards kablooey. To remedy this problem, Biosphere's engineers had to help the facility breathe, so they gave it a lung.
A lung?
Yep, a gigantic 40,000-pound lung.
So you feeling strong today? Did you have your Wheaties this morning?
I didn't.
Okay, all right.
I had coffee.
We'll see if this will work for you then.
Okay.
So we're in one or two of these geodesic domes. Inside of that is this large diaphragm. So this aluminum dish here weighs about 16 tons, okay? The rubber membrane weighs about 4 tons. Wow. So combined weight is about 20 tons, or approximately 40,000 pounds.
Oh my God.
And so what happens is the air expands inside Biosphere, it's got to go somewhere, it comes in here, path of least resistance, it pushes this up, and then at night, this weight pushes down on the air and pushes it back inside Biosphere. So by this structure going up and down, it regulates air pressure inside the facility, all while keeping the pressure relatively constant. Wow. And the reason I asked you if you had your Wheaties is, so if we grab this, we can pull down and you and I can move 40,000 pounds.
Whoa! That's awesome.
And all that's holding this up is differential air pressure. There's no crane, there's no hoist, there's no big winch that's moving. And so this thing will just go up and down, it just oscillates.
That's amazing.
Okay, that's
and
pretty sweet.
And I tell you, when you lose a lot of oxygen, and our oxygen went down quite far, it went from 21% down to 14.2%, my goodness, do you feel dreadful. I mean, we were dragging ourselves around the biosphere, and we had sleep apnea at night, so you'd wake up gasping with breath, because that's your blood chemistry's changed, and that you literally do that. You stop breathing, and then you take a breath, and it wakes you up, and it's very irritating. And everybody outside thought we were dying. I mean, the media was making it sound like we were dying, and I had to call up my mother every other day saying, "No, Mum, it's fine, we're not dead, we're fine. And the doctor was, in fact, checking us to make sure we were, in fact, fine. But, in fact, he was the person that was most susceptible to the oxygen. And one day, he couldn't add up a line of figures, and it was time for us to put oxygen in. And you might think, well, boy, your life support system was failing you. Wasn't that dreadful? Yes. In a sense, it was terrifying, except that I knew that I could walk out the airlock door at any time if it really got bad. Though who was going to say, "I can't take it anymore"? Not me, that was for sure. But on the other hand, it was the scientific gold of the project, because we could really crank this baby up as a scientific tool and see if we could, in fact, find where those 7 tons of oxygen had gone. And we did indeed find it, and we found it in the concrete. Essentially, it had done something very simple. We had put too much carbon in the soil in the form of compost. It broke down, it took oxygen out of the air, put CO2 into the air, and it went into the concrete. Pretty straightforward, really. So at the end of the 2 years, when we came out, we were elated, because in fact, although you might say we had discovered something that was quite, when your oxygen is going down, stopped working, essentially, in your life support system, that's a very bad failure, except that we knew what it was and we knew how to fix it, and nothing else emerged that really was as serious as that.
Along with the oxygen loss, Biosphere 2 experienced a number of other problems, including massive plant and animal die-offs. The biospherians had difficulty raising enough food to feed themselves and were constantly hungry. This contributed to morale problems, causing a rift in the group, splitting them into 2 factions, and these problems, along with the abrupt resignation of the project's scientific advisory board, seemed to confirm the view that the biosphere was just for show and not actual science. A second mission was attempted in March of 1994. This second crew was able to fix some of the problems the first crew had, but because of management disputes and dissension among the crew that culminated in 2 biospherians sabotaging the closed system, the mission ended after only 6 months.
We proved the concept, more or less. People, on the other hand, was a different subject. We were, I don't know that we were fixable. We all went quite nuts, I will say. And we all live in. And in Biosphere 2, I totally understood that I had a huge impact on my biosphere every day, and it had an impact on me very viscerally, very literally. So I went about my business. Paragon Space Development Corporation, a little firm I started with people while I was in the biosphere because I had nothing else to do. And one of the things we did was try to figure out how small can you make these biospheres and what can you do with them. And so we sent one onto the Mir space station. We had one on the shuttle and one on the International Space Station for 16 months, where we managed to produce the first organisms to go through complete multiple life cycles in space, really pushing the envelope of understanding how malleable a life systems are. And I'm also proud to announce that you're getting a sneak preview. On Friday, we're going to announce that we're actually forming a team to develop a system to grow plants on the moon, which is going to be pretty fun. And the legacy of that was a system that we were designing, an entirely sealed system to grow plants to go on Mars. And part of that is that we had to model very rapid circulation of CO2 and oxygen and water through this plant system. As a result of that modeling, I ended up, in all places, in Eritrea in the Horn of Africa. Eritrea, formerly part of Ethiopia, as one of those places that is astonishingly beautiful, incredibly stark, and I have no understanding of how people eke out a living there. It is so dry. This is what I saw. But this is also what I saw. I saw a company that had taken seawater and this sand, and they were growing a kind of crop that will grow on pure salt water without having to treat it, and it will produce a food crop. In this case, it was oilseed. It was astonishing. They were also producing mangroves in a plantation. And the mangroves were providing wood and honey and leaves for the animals so that they could produce milk and whatnot like we had in the biosphere. And all of it was coming from this, shrimp farms. Shrimp farms are a scourge on the earth, frankly, from an environmental point of view. They pour huge amounts of pollutants into the ocean. They also pollute their next door neighbors, so they're all shitting each other's ponds, quite literally. And what this project was doing was taking the effluent of these and turning them into all of this food. They were literally turning pollution into abundance for a desert people. They had created an industrial ecosystem of a sense.
If the original Biosphere 2 missions taught us anything, it's that there's a huge blind spot in our understanding of Earth. So since the end of the original mission, the facility has been used as a gigantic Earth sciences laboratory.
So we can learn about those blind spots.
Yeah, most Earth science experiments are done on the very small scale in beakers and small lab setups.
Not always a great model for something as massive and complex as the Earth.
And the only way to test Earth systems is to use the Earth itself.
But that must be pretty hard, if not impossible, to control all the variables.
But biosphere is this intermediate step where you have these established biological communities and you can come in and say, hey, I want to increase the temperature and look at how the system behaves, or I want to cause a drought, or I want to change the atmospheric concentration, whether it's CO2 or some other gas, and look at collectively how this whole system responds. And there's no other place in the world at this scale that you can do those types of experiments.
Some of the earliest research at Biosphere focused on manipulating CO2 levels in the atmosphere.
To model projected CO2 levels in our own atmosphere and see what happens.
So we've heard about carbon dioxide going up in the atmosphere, and we hear a lot of the debates centering around how that's going to change the temperature of the Earth. But one thing we know for sure is that as you increase atmospheric CO2, it's a gas that's soluble in water, and what ends up happening as it diffuses into the water, it begins to lower the pH.
This is called ocean acidification. It was theorized for a long time, but was first demonstrated on a large scale by researchers from Columbia University at Biosphere 2.
They were the first institution, the first research institution to really manage biosphere and sort of kick the tires and see what it could be used ecologically.
Increasing the acidity of the ocean environment in Biosphere 2 had detrimental effects on the growth of its coral reef.
And this doesn't bode well for the Earth's oceans if this happens to them, since coral reefs provide a habitat for a quarter of all marine species on the planet.
At this moment, the University of Arizona is getting set to conduct the world's largest Earth sciences experiment at Biosphere 2.
The world's largest?
The world's largest. It's called the Landscape Evolution Observatory, and its main purpose is to study how water flows through soil. They built 3 artificial sloping landscapes housed in a 5,000 square meter facility. It's pretty big. That's a very wide water slide.
It is, and this is the top view, and a lot of people say that, is this the water slide or the ski slope inside Biosphere? But all kidding aside, this is the world's largest Earth science experiment, and it took many different disciplines coming together to ultimately come up with questions, and what you see here, the design of this. We think of water as something that we understand very well, but a lot of the hydrologists will tell you that the principles that we use to describe its behavior, especially as it moves below the surface, they were all developed in the 19th and 20th century, and we're still using them today.
Because of our limited knowledge of how water moves through a terrain, it's very unpredictable.
We hear about it all the time. There's either too little water, for example, in Southern California, or there's too much water like Texas is getting. There's never this happy medium. And so water is one of those resources that is going to be most significantly impacted by, a change in our climate. But understanding its behavior is critical for us understanding, as it rains in the mountains, how much is going to end up downstream for societal needs.
Layer by layer, they'll build a replica landscape by first laying bare soil and then slowly adding plant life, so they can see how the flow of water through soil changes as you change the landscape.
The other really cool thing, and maybe it's not cool when I mention it to you right now, but we're standing underneath a structure that weighs 2 million pounds, okay?
Let's get out of here.
Yeah. So, but it's on these columns right here, each one of them has a scale, and they tell you exactly what the weight of the structure is, and as you add water, you can see that weight go up, and as water leaves the system, you can see that weight go down. And what we can do is it allows us to mass balance the system. Where is every droplet of water going? And the hope will be is this will give us a better idea of the behavior so that we can make more informed decisions. Biosphere's original purpose was to model what it would take to keep people alive in space for an extended period of time.
Are they ever going to get back to that kind of research?
Matt, I'm glad you asked. The University of Arizona is doing just that.
How can we take what we learned in Biosphere and potentially create bioregenerative life support systems? Biosphere was extremely ambitious, and they tried to put in as much diversity and all of those natural systems that you find outside. Well, they quickly learned that it was very difficult to balance all of that. So the next generation, if you want to say, was to go with really a hydroponic setup. What you've got here now is a system that's growing and recycling nutrients, carbon, oxygen in a way that, in theory, could potentially support a person for 1 year.
This is how much would be needed for one person?
Yes. You'd start out with the appropriate amount of water, and then it would just recycle that water. It would eventually be able to recycle, there are components to recycle your waste, and to produce enough oxygen as well as caloric intake.
This is just a model, but the idea is that eventually a lunar greenhouse like this would be sufficient to provide all the food, water, and oxygen for one astronaut on a daily basis.
So we really now have a unique opportunity to leverage this one-of-a-kind, world's largest earth science laboratory in ways that no one could have even envisioned early on. We only have Earth, and we're dependent on the systems and the processes. And so figuring out a way in which we're able to continue to have those resources and exist in a way that's favorable for us is crucial.
So what do you guys think? The Earth is a giant mystery. Will we ever unlock all of its secrets through experiments like Biosphere2, or will it be forever out of our reach?
The Industrial Revolution and Prometheus has given us this, the ability to light up the world. It has also given us this, the ability to look at the world from the outside. Now, we may not all have another biosphere that we can run to and compare it to this biosphere, but we can look at the world and try to understand where we are in its context and how we choose to interact with it.
Thank you.